Ideally, I'd like the Health Minister or the Attorney General, or perhaps even the Governor General, to be reading something like this to give to Australians to stop the null and void laws, the acts of slavery and acts of torture in Australia. Today we're concentrating on the acts of slavery. Slavery is a one-way transaction, so slave doesn't get a choice, and that's what happens with forced psychiatry. That the psychiatrists are deceptive in their capturing of human beings by force and enslaving them for their data for human research, as well as their person, their body, taking them into their facilities, is a key factor in what the Psy do. So it's clinical psychologists and psychiatrists and the coterie. And this is via the data mine collection agencies and potentially after death trading for those victims of psychiatrists who have been denied the right to opt out of organ donating. Capacity law isn't and should never be about human traits. Medicine making up rubbish terms of hate speech that don't correlate to carrying a microbial or microscopic item that it can be considered a quarantine potential carry issue. A quarantine would not be subject a farm animal to a mental health diagnosis. And I put that in inverted commas because as a border crossing issue, it's a null issue. It's the fact is, when there's a cover-up for human trafficking for medico-slavery, terms used to define the slave are irrelevant. A psychiatrist has absolute power over the life of the person they enslave, their fortune and their liberty of the person that the psychiatrist enslaves. And the psychiatrists also have the ability to silence their victims, no mouthing off about psychiatrist violations and such. The person is held in bondage systematically for the rest of their life. Very hard it has been for a person to get free from this servitude offence of the Psy. Protecting slavery for those who profit by it, when a state territory insists on keeping the servitude offence, safeguards being used to protect the particular institution doing the enslaving from abolitionists by enslavers claiming special privileges above the law and symptomatising anti-psychiatry and pro-human rights politics and other such anti-slavery and politics and expression. How much a person subjected to forced psychiatry is sold, bequeathed, inherited or exchanged for another person more apt for a particular black triangle experiment that needs to have closer inspections to give journalists an eye full of what is being traded as well as the human themselves. So if samples of data or human body markers were to be included, that'd be a human body extraction offence. The term the psychiatrists use, absconding, for those that they enslave, is a term generally used on children. So there isn't an infantilization of people. The term fugitive slaves being only an old term. However, the term AWOL is often used, yet lost to follow is not in similar way a political prisoner or a prisoner of war. That is not a term used for that. It's used for case studies regularly. Lost to follow up. That generally means that there's probably a research that they can find that's been done forcefully without their permission. The people have been subjected to punitive measures, punishments by the psychiatrists that have enslaved them, and these have minimal legal limitations. People subjected to the psychiatrists have been afforded no, I would say, no legal protections against slavery and extreme barbaric forms of punishment and torture. So it needs to be challenged, and all these laws need to be made null and void by the Health Minister or the Attorney General or our Prime Minister. The Sai are not slave, however, have gotten away with this, and sometimes only stopped with a misconduct deduction point or suspension of their right to practice psychiatry. And for a victim of psychiatrists who have very limited or no appeal to formal institutions, if left on their own, is a hallmark of institutional slave trade occurring. For a person enslaved by a psychiatrist to be allowed to give testimony should be happening. But what is happening? A person enslaved by a psychiatrist is not allowed to give testimony, or their testimony is not given the same weight as a free person's. And that makes for a need for a huge shift in law practices, policing, courts, and for the legislature it is too confusing to compute, and due to this conflict. Mobility is limited for the people enslaved by psychiatrists, sometimes to a 23-hour isolation in a one room by themselves, or tying those enslaved to bed so the person cannot freely move for months. Degrading, cruel, as well as disabling, and it kills people. If you have any further questions on this, do let me know. There's some additional comments I could make about this pertaining to some of the more covert experiments that the psychiatrists are doing, but particularly to it, we're looking at the needs to be stopped at a federal level. The politicians need to pull their finger out, so to speak, and do something now, because this is the main issue in Australia that they should be looking at. If they're looking at the covert weaponry and so forth and so on, that's another area, but they're not going to get very far on that if they don't look at what is the problem here. They've got a conflict in the law that is huge. Thank you for listening. I'm going to end this session now.